It is very rare that Sidious ever does his own dirty work. Throughout his entire life, secrecy was not the only name of the game, but was paramount to the survival and the victory of the Sith. As a Dark Lord in the rule of two, it was up to Sidious to tie up all the loose ends that could end up exposing him as a Dark Lord. This even extended into the reign of the Empire, when Sidious thought it was prudent to keep his identity hidden from the galaxy. The thinking behind this is actually pretty brilliant. Sidious didn't want to see the public have a Force-based ruler simply replaced with another after the fall of the Jedi, and so he used assassins or apprentices to take care of what needed to be done, and those that needed to be removed. But there were a few times, albeit extremely rare, that Sidious went and took care of matters personally. One may think of his duel with Maul and Savage Opress as an example, but during the Galactic Civil War, the Emperor now would rarely participate in any battle or skirmish. He had instruments like Vader and the Inquisitors, but there is one battle where Palpatine made a personal appearance as the Dark Lord. In fact, it was the only time he openly exposed himself as a Sith Lord to his Imperial subjects, and then he proceeded to carry out a private massacre. This was the mission to Bothan, the time that Darth Sidious let loose and slaughtered an entire city. During the Age of the Empire, Palpatine continued to keep his identity as a Sith a secret. He explains why in his manifesto, stating that it would look bad to the public if one Force-based regime was replaced by another, which to the untrained commoner looks identical to the first. Sidious spent a long time ensuring that the Jedi looked as bad as possible, and the average person didn't know what a Sith even was. So if he were to out himself as a Force wielder and a saber-wielding wizard after denouncing the entirety of the Jedi Order, it would look terrible. Instead, he reclused himself away and had Vader be the face of the Empire's wrath. He allowed everyone to make up their own theories on who or what Vader even was. The truth about his identity didn't really matter at all, because people were good at scaring themselves with their own imaginations. And so while Vader went out and did all of the dirty work that Palpatine needed done, the Emperor remained peacefully in seclusion. Here he would carry out his job as the overseer of the Empire. He would study the dark side, perform rituals, and establish sinister plans and projects that would be used in the future. With Vader, the Inquisitors, and especially with the Emperor's hands, there was genuinely no need for him to ever leave this seclusion. But as we know, Palpatine would eventually get bored in the latter years of his rule. We talked about this in a previous video where he mentioned how he became unsatisfied and felt ultimately unfulfilled by his grand empire. Sidious was indeed a schemer, but if one thing can be learned about reading the Darth Plagueis novel and looking at Palpatine within his youth, he was an animal at heart. He enjoyed the violence of battle, the primal feeling of tearing life from an enemy with his bare hands. This scent of fresh blood was more pleasing to him than the finest incense. The sound of terrified screams more soothing to Sidious than the most exquisite music. Sidious was not forgiving to those that failed him simply because it was an opportunity to amuse himself, torturing them in horrific ways he could only imagine. And when the Galactic Civil War broke out, Palpatine suddenly had a massive new enemy to play with. Palpatine became much more involved in galactic affairs now that the Death Star was being constructed, and the Senate was disintegrated. At first, the rebellion was a detestable thing to him. The gall of an insurgency was something he desired to crush as quickly and even as openly as possible. They had become a massive thorn, especially once the rebels started creeping into the very infrastructure of the Empire. But their brazen revolution only offered Palpatine with the excuse that he had been waiting for, to finally get out of his cramped offices and act as a true Sith Lord once more. And in the year 0 BBY, an event would occur that made Palpatine finally lift himself up from his throne and decided to do things the old ways. Moff Kallist had turned traitor. Utilizing the Bothan spynet, he had gained priority secret plans for the Death Star and had then slipped them to the Rebel Alliance. The Bothan spynet was an extremely well-organized intelligence network that had developed hundreds of years prior by the Bothan species. It was all about collecting intelligence on political enemies and either using it themselves or selling it to the highest bidders. During the Dark Times, most of their intelligence gathering was obviously against the Empire. No other spy network in the entire galaxy could claim the level of expansion that the Bothan spynet could. It consisted of thousands of spies, informants, and data collection droids that fed into a centralized command structure. Using trade, bribery, espionage, and observation, the spynet obtained information from every corner of the galaxy. And of course, Moff Kallist would be a mole for them, acquiring Death Star codes and snaking them through the spynet to the rebellion. Darth Vader would track down this Moff through a number of worlds before making a stand against the Empire with his own Star Destroyer flagship. However, his ship was disabled and the Moff was captured. He was then brought directly for an audience with Emperor Palpatine, who brutally tortured him until he gave up his treachery. The Moff revealed that he had given the plans to the Bothans. Sidious, of course, was furious, and he murdered him as soon as his usefulness was over. For those who know anything about the production of the very first Death Star, you knew that it was a very difficult development process. In fact, it was described as development hell. If we aren't to include all of the construction that took place during and prior to the Clone Wars, this was a project that was over 25 years in the making. It was mired down by Sidious having to wiggle around the Senate. He had to cut costs on everything to put as much money as possible into the weapon. This caused a lot of issues on several fronts for the Empire, including their navy. All of the construction of the various individual parts had to be done in total secrecy, and many shipyards' worlds were converted for just that purpose. And then they had to find and use secret hyperlanes that no one knew about in order to make sure the parts to the Death Star could not be tracked. The construction itself was hindered by repeated uprising by the Wookiee slaves, numerous structural issues, and constant shipment interference from the Rebel Alliance. And it wasn't just secret from the public, but many levels of the Empire as well. We did a video on just how terrible the construction process of the Death Star actually was. And so, after funneling all of this time, stress, and resources into a single project, Palpatine was absolutely livid that the plans had been stolen and taken by the Bothans. Standing up from his throne, Sidious told both Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin to step aside. This he would be handling personally. The Emperor did not take an army as a show of force. He did not take Star Destroyers or an orbital bombardment. Palpatine took only himself, 2 royal guards in his shuttle, and went to the world of Bolwafwi, the homeworld of the Bothans. Touching down on the world, Sidious exited to find a welcoming committee kneeling before him. The Bothans greeted him as nobility and asked what they owed the great honor of having the Emperor visit their little world. But Sidious only responded by saying, "Your disloyalty to the Empire." He then reached out his hands and sprayed a torrent of force lightning, instantly executing every single one of them. The Bothans that were present were horrified, never having seen such power, or even having known that the Emperor was capable of it. He had only been an old man to them prior. And then, Palpatine takes out an old friend who had not seen the light of day in nearly a decade: his lightsaber. As soon as the Crimson Blade ignited, his personal guards went to work. Palpatine and the guards would storm the city as a 3-man army. They slaughtered every Bothan in sight without discretion and without mercy. The local security attempted to fight back against them, but they were only met with the full power of the dark side realized. Palpatine would even be so cruel as to dominate the minds of many Bothans, corrupting them in the Force and compelling them to massacre their own kin along with him. For the first time in decades, Palpatine let his inner monster loose on a bloodlusted rampage. Never before had Sidious actually been on the front lines of a ground battle before, but there he was, issuing orders, taking out the Bothan's assets, and wielding his lightsaber and the dark side indiscriminately. For this moment, Palpatine actually got to feel what it was like to be a Sith of old. In his personal writings, he had always praised and respected Malgus for his battlefield prowess, and now Palpatine himself got to live that. As a rule of 2 Sith, he may have never gotten this opportunity. In the end, he made sure to have his guards kill even the Bothans that he corrupted. And finally the planet surrendered, and even admitted that they had been the ones to beam the information to the Rebel Alliance on Tantive 4. Again, this is Legends continuity, so the story is very different from Rogue One. But Palpatine would then dispatch Vader to intercept the Corvette and recover the plans. But from that day forth, the Bothans knew exactly who Palpatine was. Just to himself, Sidious had always wished he could show his true power to those around him. Secrecy had always served him well, but he always wanted to make others kneel in fear. For years he desired to show the Jedi Council what he was truly capable of. Every time he sat in a room together with them, he had to hold himself back from letting them know the real power of the Force, of the dark side. And as Emperor, he had to be wise in whom he revealed his true nature to. Things were complicated with the Senate after all. But by the time of 0 BBY, the Senate had been siphoned so much of its power that it was nothing but a useless husk. Palpatine's regional governors were the ones who actually called the shots, and he only allowed the Imperial Senate to believe they made a difference while they squabbled about and passed bills, those that never actually made any change whatsoever. And so because of the Senate's power and it being purely theoretical in the months leading up to the abolishment, it was far too late for them to do anything about their new emperor. In the same manifesto that Sidious stated he would remain hidden even as emperor, he also stated that it would not be permanent. In his own words, by the time the galaxy realizes who they put their power with, it would be far too late. And that was this instance. Even if the Bothan spread the news of the massacre and Sidious's powers in the Force and even spread it across the galaxy, no one could do a thing. If the entire galaxy found out he was a Sith Lord, it wouldn't change anything. But Palpatine didn't exactly get away with this either. The Bothan people did not cower before him, and were instead emboldened to support the rebellion even more. Prior to this, they had only used the Spynet as they always had, which was more of a neutral party who favored the highest bidder. But now they used the full power of the Spynet to support the Alliance, and would steal the plans for the second Death Star as well. Of course, Palpatine organized for them to do so in order to lure the rebels into a trap, and he would also make them pay heavy casualties for it. However, the Bothans were instrumental to the rebels' success and eventual victory, and they would be founding members of the New Republic afterwards. But this was the incredibly strange time when Palpatine decided to get his own hands dirty for a change, revealing himself as a Sith Lord and slaughtering an entire city. This is one of the instances where Palpatine simply could not help himself. He had stood for so long using so many minions to do his work, but when it came to the Death Star, he didn't take any chances, even with Lord Vader or Grand Moff Tarkin. His rage was so palpable that he had to actually release it on his enemy. He had to watch those responsible perish in front of him. Sidious is a schemer, and ironically he's at his most dangerous when he's hiding in the shadows. But I do wish we got more moments like this, where Sidious decides to throw caution to the wind and display his true power as a true Dark Lord. And what do you think, my friends and fellow lore junkies? How do you think the war with the rebels would have gone if Palpatine actually joined Vader on the front lines? For those of you who are curious, the story occurs in Star Wars Empire at War. It is a military strategy game that the events are considered a part of Legends. But anyway, my friends, until next time, thank you so much for joining us in the archives today, and as always, may the Force be with you.